Hello again, and as I was saying earlier, today is the anniversary of Buddha's first teaching, so it's quite an auspicious day. And we're going to be talking about the 12 links of dependent arising, or the interdependent links, which um, were supposedly the meditation that realization that Buddha had when he achieved enlightenment, and from which he developed the very first turning of the wheel of the Dharma. So it's very appropriate, very serendipitous. So I didn't plan it. But first, let's spend a moment to try to. So it's about 2,500, roughly 2,506 years ago that he first taught Dharma. It's quite special. Let's try to develop a sense of motivation. Again, to do our best to think about whatever benefits we can find from the teaching, and to do the best that we can to use that in our daily life, in our moment-to-moment life, to inform us, become better people, ideally even to begin to start our journey on the spiritual path to enlightenment or the equivalent, so that we can benefit most effectively, benefit also human beings. So let's just take a minute to think that through and to commit that to ourselves. Thank you very much. As I said, this is chapter 21. We're on the 12 factors of dependent arising, or the 12 independent links. So last week we finished. We're still on the middle scope. We're still on if you like, the main body of the pyramid of the spiritual path, of path to enlightenment. And within that, what we really were doing last time, we were talking about the two main parts of this, which is the suffering, the suffering and the cause of suffering, which are the origins, true origins. This is the noble truths. And one way of presenting the truth of suffering is by looking at the relationship between karma and view. And this was really what we did in terms of previous weeks. Also, a previous week rather. And looking really at karma klesha, this is the afflictions and karma and how they work together, is one way of being able to determine that even high rebirth, especially after considering karma, that the way in which we're bound samsara is through our karma, our contaminated karma. The karma keeps us in samsara. And our klesha, which is our afflictions, these states of mind which keep us unsettled and disturbed, and therefore prevent us from being able to achieve enlightenment. So another way of doing this, and this is what Je Rinpoche says, is it's not different. It's the same sort of approach, but a different presentation, is through thinking about the 12 factors of dependent arising. Now, in terms of the 12 factors of dependent arising, this text is found in every tradition without exception. This sort of text, this breakdown of this analysis is found especially in the Pali, Tibetan, Mahayana traditions, but all Buddhist traditions. And one of the reasons why is, like the Four Noble Truths, it's really essentially the essence of Buddhism. If we wanted to say what is Buddhism, one way we could say it is to say it's the teaching and the practice, the teaching and understanding of the 12 factors of dependent arising. And what they are before we go into them individually and so on, are they represent or they demonstrate the mechanism by which we are bound to samsara. So it really shows us precisely how it is that we're kept in this cycle of rebirth and suffering. And needless to say, because of its centrality and because of it revealing the mechanism by which we're bound in samsara, there is a huge amount of teachings based on this. Way more than we're going to be able to deal with in 1 week, or the small chapter that Lam Tsong-kha-pa gives to it. What is really important is that it is through understanding the dependent arising that we can really begin to unpack the meaning of insight, indeed emptiness is impossible to understand without dependent arising. Now, you've heard me say this before. You heard me saying this about impermanence. You've heard me saying this about karma. You've heard me saying this about all these things. And the reason for that is that all of these things, impermanence, death, rebirth, karma, all of the things that we've discussed, except possibly refuge and respect for the teacher, are wrapped into this one package. This package called the 12 interdependent links. So the 12 interdependent links in many ways is an exposition of the nature of samsara and how we are bound there. Now, you're all probably familiar with the wheel of life, which is often called the Tibetan wheel of life, which was actually developed in India, but in sort of the 10th or 11th century in India. And it, with the 5 or 6 different regions that you see of the wheel of life, is a small boundary made up of pictures. And those pictures at the top of them have, here's an example of one of them here. You can see this is a blow up of one of the pictures around the wheel of life. And if I'm clever, I could possibly show that, how this. So you can see, I think here, this is like, you can see basically how this is the beginning of a circle that goes. Sorry, there we are. The circle that goes round the wheel of life. And each one of those, that circle of pictures, there are 12 of them, and each one of those represents a symbolic representation of one of the 12 factors of dependent arising. So one of the things about dependent arising is, which is really important, is that some people get confused about this in terms of thinking about it regarding the idea that everything is connected to each other. Now, this comes from another sutra, I think called the Brahmanet Sutra, and it's found in Chinese Mahayana mainly, but this is actually a very different meaning and a different text. We're not saying that everything is interconnected. What we're talking about is how we are bound to samsara. So it's primarily looking at our own minds and our own cycle of mind, not to do with how we're connected with the universe. That's not what we're doing here. And secondly, what we're also doing is if we find it hard to if we find it hard initially to accept rebirth, then we can still use this mechanism, this causal chain, to see how our minds continue to be bound by an unenlightenment within it from a moment-to-moment basis. Remember, if we accept the idea that rebirth is a rebirth of moment of consciousness to moment of consciousness, then these 12 still apply, but they apply in a very slightly different way, which we can look at later on if we have the time. So within the scope of that, Lama Tsongkhapa starts off and says, well, what are they? Which is fair enough. And he says, the first one is ignorance. So the first in the chain of 12 is ignorance. He then points out, so there's some various different teachings on this. Vasubandhu wrote a book called the Treasury of Knowledge. Now, Vasubandhu and Sangha were both very, very important to Lama Tsongkhapa and the Tibetan tradition. And Vasubandhu initially was a Theravadan. He wasn't a Mahayana practitioner at all. And he wrote this book called Treasury of Knowledge. And then he felt, I'm not sure about this. And he joined another group and he wrote a critique on his original book. And then he made it from his brother, he became persuaded that actually the right path was the Mahayana. And this shows in many ways that he was a very, very great scholar, but what it shows is actually there's not much conflict between these different traditions. In fact, nobody criticized him for this. It was just the way in which he perceived or understood Buddha Dharma from earlier life into later life. So this book here, The Compendium of Knowledge, really talks specifically about there's a whole section based on the 12 links of existence, and he says in this that ignorance is like animosity and falsehood. Now this is actually I'm not going to go into too much into detail of this, but this really primarily is concerned with the way in which what the words mean. And primarily, it doesn't mean that ignorance has the same nature of these things, but essentially, ignorance, like in English, if you look at the English meaning of it, ignorance is non-knowledge, right? It is a short for not, and gnosis or knowledge is another word for Greek for knowledge. So, in this sense, ignorant is a negative word. And what he wants to do is point out here, and this is what Vasubandhu wants to point out, is there are two things going on. One of them is a mere lack of knowing something, and the other one is uh, is uh, um, an active ignorance, a sort of belligerence, if you like. And what he's arguing in this particular case is that this type of ignorance in this particular case is a view that is wrong. In other words, it's more like a belligerence rather than just the absence of understanding. On the other hand, Dharmakirti, who came about 100 years later, argues the other way around. So he says, well, it can also be seen that essentially, if we recognize that the remedy of samsara, which is being able to have direct insight into the nature of reality, is what cuts through cuts through the artificial sense of self, or then we could also say that um, the ignorance is a lack of this view. So it doesn't really, in one sense, one can argue, it says we can either say it is actually the delusion that believes in the self, or you could say it's the absence of what cuts the delusion. In other words, because remember, going back from last week, what we're trying to do is to uncover or recognize the lack of a self. So we put something there that isn't there, right? We imagine there to be something which isn't there, like the snake in the grass. Again, we were talking about that last week. So what we're doing is we're saying that if we're seeing the snake in the grass, this is like in this particular case this self arising, this idea of a concrete objective self arising, then that itself is an active ignorance. If we're aware of the fact that this arises because of a lack of insight, then one could argue it's an absence of insight. So I don't want to go into this too much, but basically what this comes down to is to recognize that the first is ignorance. So this is the picture that we get on the Wheel of Life for the sign for ignorance, and that is it's hard to see here, but this here is a stick. So it normally nowadays it would be a white cane, but it's essentially a blind man with a stick wandering across without being able to see anything. So this is a visual mnemonic used in Tibetan systems and originally Indian systems for meaning ignorance. And this is recognized primarily as an affliction. It's a mental state which causes trouble. So the next of the next ones, the number two, don't worry, they're not all going to be this long, is karma. So actually it's called compositional activity in this, in the sense that there is not, it's not an individual that's causing an act, it's the composition of the mind and body, but primarily the mind, which leads to an action, leads to action. So it is karma, and it's the action of karma, but in the way in which it's normally depicted is called a compositional activity. And he says then, and then what he says is there are two types, in this particular case, there are two types of karma. There's the one which goes downwards, non-meritorious, and the one that goes upwards, or makes us happy, and this causes happy rebirth. And then within the happy karma, there's that which meritorious karma, there's the one which takes us to the desire realms, and then one that takes us above into the formless realms. So the compositional activity here, the picture for this, can you see it all right? Is a potter. So it's maybe a little bit blurred to see, but essentially he's making pots here, and is a clay potter. And the idea is he's composing or he's making things up. This is the karma action. So this is the potter of compositional activity. And whereas ignorance is an affliction, karma is karma. It's a karmic action. It's an action. It's what makes things happen. Okay. So then the next is consciousness. So this is the third of the 12. Consciousness, compositional activity, karma, and ignorance. These three are the three strong binding forces of samsara. Okay. So without consciousness, we're not able to have it. We're not alive. We're not able to experience. Without karma, well, while we have a mind and while we have ignorance, there's always going to be karma. But karma is intentionality, the ability to do something, the empowerment to actually make a difference. So if we're completely passive, mentally, like for instance, if we're in a coma, then there's not very much karma generated during that time. Other times there's always karma. Even if we're thinking something, then karma happens. So in that sense, karma comes with consciousness while we're in samsara. And then ignorance is the binding force, which is not being able to see clearly. So what I should have mentioned with ignorance is there are two types of ignorance particularly. One of them is the ignorance of the nature of self, or the nature of existence or emptiness. And the other one is the ignorance of not understanding the consequences of actions, right? Not thinking through about consequences of actions clearly. So these two primarily are the two types of ignorance that we hold that bind us to the samsara. And we'll deal with them. We'll deal with that a little bit later. So consciousness, again, Buddha often talks about 6 types, or Buddhism often talks about 6 types of consciousness, because each of the senses that we have, like the eye and hearing and so on, each of these is is considered to be a type of consciousness. So when we smell something, there's a smell consciousness arises. There's a little bit different in terms of the way in which we see things in the West, but there's nothing directly obstructive to it, because we recognize that the nerve system goes through and is connected to, for instance, the optic nerve, right? So the way in which the sense base, if you like, the retina, and the sense consciousness, which is it still happens in the brain, but is essentially our connection with what we see. This is generally considered to be just a part of the overarching central nervous system. Whereas in Buddhism, it's just, we talk about 6 types of consciousness, the 6th one being the mental consciousness rather than a sense consciousness. So in this particular case, the consciousness of the 12 links is the mental consciousness, the one which is involved in karma, or action or thinking, intention, right? This is what I'm going to do, and then I go and do it. Now, there's a subtle aspect of consciousness, which is that when we're looking at how it binds us into samsara, there's what's known as the cause consciousness and the effect consciousness, and both of these are under the same third level. So cause consciousness is basically what's going to cause future rebirths, and effect consciousness is what has been caused by these links in the 12. And the again, the picture here, and you'll see, if you're very aware, you've noticed that we're going clockwise around the wheel, yeah. And this is a monkey. It's very pink. It is a pink monkey, and the reason why a monkey is used to represent consciousness is because if you've ever meditated, you'll know that the mind tends to hop around in a rather playful manner and never stay where you want it to. So this is the idea that the monkey represents consciousness. And Je Rinpoche says specifically here that that the latent karmic propensities that keep us that have come from previous karmic. So the idea here is that if we have wrong views, these wrong views that generate wrong karma, the wrong karma itself not only causes all sorts of difficult problems for us, sufferings for us, but also we develop this habit, if you like, of doing these things again and again. So these become what are known as latent predispositions in our future mind, and these latent predispositions are known as the consciousness of the cause period, um, and um, and then when they arise again in the future life, then they're the consciousness of the effect period. So sorry, and the consciousness of the time in which you accumulate, so in those moments where the afflictions of your mind create intentions and actions that will create these actions which cause consequences, this is your cause consciousness. This is the intentional actions there that cause the problems, and then the result of those are the effects. That's easy enough to understand. The next is name and form. Now, name and form is another way of talking about what's known as the five aggregates. So this is the five classic aspects of the person. So within a Buddhist context, so before we go on to that, I'll do that next, sorry. So when we go on to that, this is not necessarily a 100% defined scientific list. What it is a descriptive list that shows a way of breaking up the person into the five different aggregates, none of which can said to be me. And this is the point in terms of when we look at analysis, in terms of what it means, where is the person, for instance, we could say, well, which of these five aggregates is the person in? So without having to, you've probably got enough, if you're not familiar with this, working out what the 12 aggregates are, rather than all 12 factors are, rather than also having to think about the five aggregates. But basically, there are two groups. There's the mind group of four, so four different aspects of mind, and then there's the body. So that's the name, which are the four types of consciousness, and then there's the body, which is form in this particular case. So we won't worry too much about what they are in this particular case, because we're really concentrating on the 12 factors of existence, of dependent arising. But we can at some point talk about five aggregates. And the five aggregates are, or name and form, what makes the person, the body, is represented by normally one, but sometimes two, in this case, two people on a boat. And you've got the rower, yeah, and so on. So I think you can see the person on the boat. And in this case, the person is symbolic of the mind, the mental aspect, and the boat represents the form. And the idea is that with the form and the mind together, we can travel across the river. Yeah. So there's this sort of idea of of how name and form are the fifth of the fourth, right? Consciousness, ignorance, karma, consciousness, name and form. Now, while we're doing this, and I'm going to go through this, we have to go through this a couple of times, but through this cycle, what we're also looking in this particular case is the development of the fetus. So the idea at first is that the initial fetus life starts with just mind, or just mind in an unformed fetus. And one of the aspects of this is that, first of all, the form in terms of the physical aspect of the fetus, and the name, the mental part of the fetus, are have access to feeling, touch, and thoughts, or very, very simple thoughts, right? Mentation. And so two of the senses are already active. These are the two to do with feeling, form, and to do with mind. And then what happens next is the development of the sense bases, in the fetal development of the sense bases. So this is just one way of looking through this, is we're looking at this point at the development of fetus, but there's a lot more going on than just that, which we'll look at too. So the consciousness and name and form are suffering. They have the aspect of suffering. So ignorance is affliction, karma is karma, and then consciousness and name and form, and quite a few following, are suffering in their nature. And then from that arise the sense bases. Okay, so these are what known as the six sources, the sense, like for instance the retina, hearing, and taste, and so on. Now again, in fact, obviously modern science has been able to show us that there are lots of senses. You know, the sense of balance, sense of direction, sense of this, sense of that. And while one could argue with the classic Buddhists who fit them all into that, of course, again, this is descriptive rather than prescriptive. So we don't need to say lose our faith in this if we find it hard to accept. If we try to read this text on its, you know, as being the definitive in everything, but traditionally there are always talking about six sense bases here. And what's mentioned is that the next aspect of fetal development, which is true if you're born in an egg or a fetus in a womb, is that these happen afterwards. So the remaining four senses, which is sight, hearing, smell, and another one, taste. Right. So these arise next. And do we have a picture of this? I think we do. It's quite strange. It's a house. Not that you'd necessarily recognize it as a house. And interestingly, what's normally the case is that they often have windows and doors on them. But essentially, the point is, because when they're formed, when the sense bases are formed, they're not active, they're not yet aware, they're not functioning. You draw these blind houses. So this means that they're still in fetal development in terms of this particular narrative. So the house, or the blind house in this particular case, represents the formation of the sense bases of the retina and the parts of the body that allow for hearing and sound and so on to happen in this particular case. So once they're actually active, then we have what's known as we have the three bases of consciousness. So there's the sense base, there's the sense object. So when the sense object, such as an object of smell, an object of taste, an object of touch happens, then that consciousness arises, right? So in that sense, what we're saying is that we've got the moment of sense consciousness arriving, um, and that sense consciousness is the smell of the bear, the what's the word, the stimulus, right? The actual stimulus that comes to mind. So not obviously not the when I say stimulus, I mean you could say the perfume is the stimulus, but actually the conscious stimulus of the perfume that takes place when there's perfume and the sense base connects, then the arising of the smell of perfume happens. That there is if you like, the mental reflection of that of the activation of that sense consciousness of the smell. So this itself is contact. Oh yeah, yeah. And contact is represented by a man and woman in full body contact. Yeah, like that. So in embrace. So this really represents the idea of where the external stimulus and the internal sense base meet, generating that consciousness. Okay, it's very, very sort of monastery safe picture, I should say. Sense. So from the sense base arises feeling. Now, feeling in this particular case is going to be ranging from unpleasant to pleasant. And this is experiential. So unlike the smell, the bear smell, this is the interpretation of that smell, the experience of that smell, which is also or taste and so on in mind. And these are where we begin to see the what arises is something that is pleasant or something that is unpleasant. And this is also where we have experiences of pleasure and suffering on the same line. So all of this division into unpleasant and pleasant experience is covered by um, feeling. Yeah. So the distinction between contact and feeling is contact is merely the arising of this. So hot temperature, the burning sensation that actually causes a physical pain is contact, but the ow that really hurts response is feeling. Yeah, and it's important because um, we can have some, if we're reasonably fast mindful, we can have some ability to transform the way in which we respond to a stimulus, right? This is where we begin to see training, mind training coming in terms of being able to think about how we can begin to respond positively to negative pain, and if you like, negatively to positive, so we can begin to actually take some sort of control over the way in which we're responding to these various different stimuli. So contact is represented by, this is, this contact is the sixth. Contact is the sixth, that was the man and woman in bed. The seventh is feeling, sorry, which is very, very graphic. Which is an arrow in somebody's eye. So, right there, yeah. So this is how the experience of feeling. I think I've got this right. Yes, all these pictures. Just have to make sure I get them right. And once we have feeling, especially when we have an ignorant mind, where we believe we buy into the sense that I am here and that is there. So the idea primarily is when we uh, um, naively recognize that I am objectively separate from everything else. And this is something we talked about before as being a typical psychological evolution. Is necessary for us as we grow to accept this. And then what we need to do is to learn to see a bit more clearly so that we don't get stuck with a stuck into a toxic relationship with that understanding. Um, and that's what our Buddhist path's about, is that if we have not recognized that and we still have this toxic relationship with the idea of self and other, where we believe the other is empowered to give us pleasure and pain rather than recognizing that it's an experience that we're having from stimulus, we begin to start craving, you know, that our favorite ice cream or whatever it is that we're craving so much, or, you know, a nice cool lemonade on a hot sunny day or whatever it is. So that that craving, which is more importantly to do with the idea of saying a craving of life, um, is based upon the idea of a self-identity, which is the whole point. So when we can let go, we'll do this later on, jumping the gun a bit. But when we begin to recognize how things really are, then these objects don't carry as, they're not as disempowering as they appear to be otherwise. So this point here is that the craving here really is talking about this. We crave um, not to be separated from pleasant feelings, and we crave to be separated from painful feelings. And this craving is the basis of um, aversion and hostility in terms of the negative craving to push away, and attachment and so on, and desire in terms of craving to fall towards, right? So this and Je makes the point, says when there's no ignorance, when we recognize actually what's going on, when we see it clearly, craving doesn't arise even when the feelings are present. So we might have a pleasant or an unpleasant feeling, but the craving no longer occurs because we recognize what's going on. Craving is represented by, in this case, a person on his own getting drunk, but often it's sort of like having a party, and often it's with a woman and they're sharing drinks together. But for some reason, this particular painting is on his own. So he's like, I don't need anyone, I'm just going to get drunk on my own. So this is what craving is like. You know, what's all about? So that's the eighth of the 12. And so yeah, up to contact, they were suffering, feeling, craving, and grasping. Feeling and craving, which is the one of experience, and wanting are afflictions. And then grasping. Actually, I'm not sure that's right. I think I may have made a mistake here, because I think grasping is definitely an affliction, and feeling is a suffering. So craving, yeah, I made a mistake here. Craving and grasping are afflictions, whereas feeling is a suffering. So from craving arrives grasping, and this is the idea primarily of saying that when you yearn after a particular thing, um, and primarily this is actually concerned with the next level up in terms of the mind, or the next level down in terms of conceptualization, but particularly holding on to our convictions without reason, holding on to the view that I'm really here without any sense, or holding on to the view that things are permanent when they're impermanent, holding on to the view that things are pure or causes of happiness when in fact they're impure and suffering. So these are the four dharmas, but also holding on to the idea that merely ethical conduct is all one needs, or that, for instance, um, holy rites. So it doesn't matter where my mind is, what state my mind is, or what I'm doing, as long as I do this special holy rite every day, then everything is all right, right? And there are some religious beliefs that have this, um, this sort of idea primarily is to say we need to be careful not to imagine that somehow waving arms or behaving in a particular way is going to help us be liberated. This is a mistake. It's a wrong view. I was reading today, actually, in preparation for today, about in the sutras, the Pali sutras, they talk about the practice of the dog, and this was one of the rite of the dog, and this was one of the rites or practices that were held in 2,500 years ago in Buddha's time, and um, there was an ascetic who was doing the practice of the dog, um, which means basically behaving like a dog, wearing no clothes, sort of moving around on all fours, panting, eating food off the floor, um, whining, and just behaving like a dog at all times. And the idea primarily, I think, was, it's a bit hard to read because a lot of the philosophy of the people who practice this is sort of, in a sense, not really what Buddha was talking about, but was the idea that somehow you're going to be reborn in a special heaven if you were able to act like a dog. And there was this yogi, a naked yogi, a naked practitioner who was doing this dog practice. And one of Buddha's um, um, students saw this naked dog yogi, and he said, "Lord Buddha, what's the effect of doing dog practice?" And Buddha said, "Don't go there, don't go there." And and um, and the student is a little bit naughty really, because it's like, Buddha says don't go there, you should really not go there. Anyways, but what is it? And Buddha said, I told you, look, just don't go there, really, just don't go there. It's not appropriate to talk about right now, right? Because he was thinking, out of respect for this person who was doing this practice, yeah. And then this monk said, but what does it mean? I mean, what does it all mean? And he said, well, okay, well, look, you asked me. I've told you 3 times not to go there. Let's close this off. So he said, okay, I'll tell you. He says, basically, if you act like a dog in your behavior, then the good thing, the good chance is that you'll be reborn a dog. But if you're actually stealing, you're just pretending to be like a dog, and you're using it just to gain arms and to pretend to be holy, then you go downstairs to hell. And the yogi who was listening burst into tears. And Buddha said, "See, so I told you, don't do, let's not talk about it right now." And the yogi said, "No, no, 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 he was right. I don't want to be a dog." So I don't know. Of course, we hear this from the Buddhist side, but from the Buddhist point of view. But it's an interesting story how we can do these practices, which we think might be of benefit, but actually there's no benefit to them at all. And and an aspect of this which is really important is if everything was an illusion, which is one of the early ideas people sometimes think that Buddhism has, then obviously whatever we believe would be efficacious. It would do what we think it does. And Buddhism has never said that. It's never said that, oh, whatever you believe it works. It's not true. So that's not correct. So these views here, this is grasping onto views primarily onto the self, the idea of a self as being a real thing, um, a real objectively real thing. Um, then this, and what I mean by self here is a essence, a true objective existence. I'm here, we can talk about I, me, you, who went to the shops. I did. That's not a problem. It's this idea of a real, solid, or unshakable, broken, like soul or Atman or this sort of thing. So this is the ninth, right? Grasping, and grasping is a this is actually not a monkey, Emma. This is a man, but shamelessly naked man who is grasping at the fruits in a tree. So this is what picture of the grasping, the symbolic representation on the wheel of life of grasping. So after that is existence or potential existence, which is, is also known as becoming, which is that because we're grasping onto ourselves, because we're grasping onto and craving these objects that we imagine give us huge amounts of pleasure, we are driven into all sorts of negative behaviors. But one of them that is most important is a continuation of existence. We find it hard to accept that, you know, we find it hard to let go of this continuation of existence. And that grasping leads to becoming, towards the rebirth, is a very, very strong, it's extremely hard to break that. And that leads us into rebirth, and that is known as becoming. And the symbol for that, not that you can really tell here, is a pregnant woman. So this is actually a woman. I can see that she's got her long hair behind her here. Um, but I think the way in which this is sort of done is she's not very comfortable. But sometimes there's another image used instead. But in this particular case, it's a pregnant woman coming. And becoming leads to, as I just said, birth. And birth, I think we don't need too much explanation on birth. Birth is what happens when you're born. And the symbol for that is a woman giving birth. Is that upside down? No, there we are. So we're almost finished around the circle now. So the 11th is birth. And 12th is aging and death. Now, this looks a bit unlike aging or death because we are Westerners. But that there is a corpse. So the way in which especially in the mountains, how people have to carry a corpse from a house to the graveyard is on their back, not in a nice coffin in a car. And so this is a corpse carrier who is carrying a corpse to the carnal ground, the cemetery. So those are the 12 links and the symbols, which I thought might help provide some sort of mnemonic or entertainment. But uh, they are important to recognize in terms of how they work and how they interact. And I will go through and brief some of this stuff, but really, when we begin to meditate on them more seriously, we should really try and find time to study them more extensively. Now, in fact, Lam Tsongkhapa's small chapter does do this in quite some detail, so I'll do my best to cover some of it. Um, so one of them is the fact there are like 4 different primary sources for explanation for what's going on here. One of them is based on Vasubandhu, as I said, is the monk who was converted twice and who wrote these important texts on it. And he said that there are so all of these really, all before I start on going into the detail, all of them really show not only how we've come into the world, but how we will continue to be reborn. Yeah. So some of these are to do with what happens as the cause, and the others to do with what happens as a subsequent effect, and how those subsequent effects become the next causes, and so on. So we end up with this cycle, literal cycle of interlinked, interlocking causes and effects. And the way in which competitive knowledge, Vasubandhu talks about this is he says there are the projecting factors. Remember, they're all called factors of dependent arising. The projecting factors, the projected factors, the actualizing factors, and the actualized factors. So the projecting, projected, actualizing, and actualized. And the projecting factors are those that we mentioned right at the beginning: ignorance, karma, and cause consciousness. These are the ones that project um, and create the basis. And from that, the projected are those which are concerned with birth, with um, the state of the mind linking through to grasping, yeah, feeling. So in this sense, it's the body and mind that leads up to feeling. So the effect consciousness named form, the aggregates, the sense bases, contact, and then the experience of contact. So those are the projected aspects. So projecting and projected themselves are the way in which they bind together. And then from feeling, we have feeling, from feeling arises the actualizing three, which is craving, grasping, and becoming. So it's craving and grasping that is, if you like, in fact, craving itself. It is this craving or thirst, this affliction that is craving pleasantness and craving absence of unpleasantness. This is the root cause of suffering. So it's these projected lead to the feeling leads to craving, and that leads to the grasping, and that leads to becoming. That's what binds us into the actualized, which is the next rebirth, the next death. So the idea primarily is, although we have these three, ignorance, karma, and cause consciousness, creating the basis, in fact, when we are reborn, those three arise again. So they arise again. The rebirth doesn't happen from them. It happens from the craving and grasping that arises from those as the initial causes. Yeah? So I am doing my very best to keep this simple. And, I think I'm failing dismally. but when we work on it, it actually does become, and because we're 12 initially, it feels quite heavy-handed. But in fact, it's not that hard to get to grips with. The idea primarily is to think how, if we work back from rather than forwards, it maybe might make it easier to understand that essentially our, our, this craving for pleasant experiences depends upon pleasant experiences and recognizes those with an ignorant mind, right? If experiences depend upon contact upon stimulus, and that stimulus depends upon the six senses, which themselves depend upon having a body that can support those six senses, right? So within that, the body itself arises from a rebirth, if you like, which is this cause, is this consciousness. And at the same point, one of the points about consciousness and ignorance is that when we have these, then there's also karma. So there's going to be a forward effect in terms of the fact that what we're doing now will affect what happens next to us and also to the universe. So therefore, the grasping at self leads to becoming, leads to a future life. The craving is what leads to becoming. Having a body with ignorance is what leads to craving. And essentially, while we are ignorant, we will continue to crave and grasp, which will keep us bound to becoming. Does that help? Can sort of pretend. Anyway, doing my very, very best. So one of the aspects of this, and again, this is important in terms of beginning to understand how we're bound in samsara, is that when we have ignorance about karma and our actions and the consequences of our actions in terms of what we do, how it affects our future, primarily mentally, right? So if I am not aware of the fact that um, um, coarse attachment or coarse hostility is going to cause me trouble later on, then I might be happy or content, or I will feel free to be hostile or cause attachment, right? So the ignorance of karma and consequence leads to a sort of, if you like, non-virtuous compositional activity. There's non-virtuous karma. Having that, one of the effects of that, the consequences of this non-virtuous karma, is that it will produce latent seeds of non-virtuous karma in my continuum of consciousness, which will arise later on. Yeah. So within that, then the that with these latent seeds of that was going to create bad karma in my consciousness, those will arise. I will commit that bad karma, and I will end up in a miserable realm as a ghost or an animal or whatever, or have a miserable time. So this is how essentially, and even within this state, therefore. Um, So this, in this state, I've now arisen as a in a low realm with the same aggregates, senses, and a miserable life, um, and there's still craving and grasping, craving to stop the pain or the stop misery, and grasping at continued existence, and also grasping at non-pain. Um, and therefore these are empowered and empower me to go into another life. So being reborn as an animal doesn't stop me from grasping, self-grasping, which leads me again into wanting to persist, and therefore I'm reborn. So this is how ignorance of specifically of actions and their consequences leads to a miserable rebirth. If I don't understand um, if I'm ignorant of the meaning of selflessness, which we were talking about earlier on, then, but I do understand this is on the assumption where I do have some understanding of karma, then my actions are going to be meritorious. They're going to be good. I'm going to have good karma because I'm aware of it. But the karma that I'm generating is still tied to a sense of belief in self. And this leads to um, some latent composition, like the latent karmic seeds, which are going to be creating good karma, but good karma that leads to both in the rebirth in the comfortable realms of samsara. Um, so I might do meditation, or I might do good deeds or whatever. But because of this strong sense of a strong ignorance about selflessness, I'm still tied to and grasping, self-grasping, and therefore um, um, and the craving, and these latent propensities are still empowered, and so therefore my subsequent birth will be in the happy rebirths. But when I say happy rebirths, it's still samsara, so I can be reborn as a human or whatever. So these two causes, these two basic ignorances, ignorance of karma and its consequence, action and consequence, and the ignorance of selflessness, bind me to samsara. The ignorance of karma leads me to low rebirth. Not understanding how karma works leads me to low rebirth, and not understanding selflessness is what keeps me within samsara without any escape at all. And Nagarjuna said, I was trying to do this as we were going along, is basically that each of these 12 is considered are considered to be one of afflictions, karmas, or sufferings, depending upon which aspect of they are. And karmas are obviously those which lead us there. Afflictions are what bind us, and sufferings are a part of the nature of being bound to samsara. So there's another part of this too. Just check on here. Which is how many lifetimes, the minimum number of lifetimes it can take to do the cycle of all 12. And Lam Tsong-kha points out saying, well, look, these are all complicated because we're talking about all sorts of different karmas and so on and so on and so on. So some karmas take many, many eons to ripen, and other karmas take, even days sometimes. So um, uh, all the different factors that are interlinked uniquely, it's not really meaningful to talk about it. But we can sort of argue essentially that the minimum, because some are to do with causes and others to do with effects in terms of the way in which the 12 are presented, that the minimum number is 2. If we line up all of the cause cases, they get matched with the effect cases. So and in that case, he says that the cause ones would be ignorance, karma, and cause consciousness, and also craving, grasping, and becoming. So they are the ones that cause the following rebirth. And the effect ones are effect consciousness, name and form, sense bases, contact, feeling, rebirth, age, and death. So one of the real advantages of this is it helps to show how which ones are leading to the following rebirth and which ones arise, and then provide the environment for the original causes arising again in this life. So what happens is we see that the name and the body and mind, which is basically effect consciousness, name, form, sense basis, contact, and feeling, as well as being born, are the effects of a karma and ignorance and craving, grasping, becoming. And yet, of course, they also provide the vehicle for those things. So they those arise again and again and again in our future rebirths. So there's a very important Mahayana sutra called the Rice Seedling Sutra, which has another way of looking at this, which might help if you're finding it hard to understand. And it says that when the seeds of consciousness are sown in the field of karma by the sower ignorance, then they are subsequently moistened by the water of craving. Then they give rise to the sprout of name and form in the mother's womb, which then gives birth of fruit to the remaining factors. So there's a way of talking about which ones lead to which one, that leads to which one. That might help, but I don't have a diagram if you were hoping for one there. So, but the rice seedling sutra has this nice sort of metaphor of how the 12 interdependent links work as a seed of being moistened and ripened, so on. So Je Rinpoche says, when you reflect on wandering in such a way through the cyclic existence, 12 factors of dependence arising are the best method for generating disenchantment with samsara. When we contemplate our karma, the virtuous, those that will put us into different rebirths, projecting karma, the virtuous and non-virtuous karma that we've accumulated over many eons, that has neither ripened nor been eradicated from antidotes such as purification. Um, um, so we should contemplate the karma. And also, again, when we think about craving and grasping in the present lifetime, and when we nurture them, we continue to wander through happy and miserable realms under their control. And then he points out, he says, arhats, in other words, even the lowest level of enlightenment, and it's not low at all, it's extremely high, it's enlightenment, but not, you don't even have to be a Buddha, or you don't even need to be you don't need to be have a deep enlightenment, just a light enlightenment. Then even though we might have immeasurable karma generated, we become free of cyclic existence because we don't have the afflictions that keep us bound. So by losing the afflictions, by losing the ignorance, we're able then to prevent our karma from ripening and keeping us bound. And there's a very famous Pong Chungwa, who's a Tibetan, and he only practiced the 12 factors of enlightenment, 12 factors of dependent arising. And he was renowned for his experiential realization. And this also is exactly what supposedly Lord Buddha, he meditated on, were the 12 factors the 12 factors of dependence arising on the night that he achieved enlightenment itself. So the fact that this one teaching is said to be the meditation that Buddha himself was using when he achieved enlightenment is very special. So he said the reflection on the progression through and the cessation of the 12 factors of miserable is the teaching for people on the foundation levels, the base levels, and the reflection on the progression through and cessation of the happy realms. In other words, this first one is saying, I said before, everything we've done so far is wrapped in this. So Lam Tsongkhapa is saying, when we look at it in terms of wrong view regarding karma, this is equivalent to the foundation, or what's known as low scope, or not foundation, base scope, base of the pyramid. When we look at it in terms of reflection through selflessness, then this is teachings for those on the medium scope, or if you like, in the current scope that's being taught. For the people of the greatest scope, the Mahayana tradition, is to use both of these, is to assess our situation according to both these practices. So do we need to concentrate on karma? Do we need to concentrate on selflessness? And then develop love and compassion for all beings who've continued to wander through cyclic existence by having been bound in these 12 factors. And then recognizing, this comes back to what I was saying before, when we recognize suffering, the true origin of suffering and how suffering arises, we recognize that while any of us are bound in samsara, we're bound to suffering. So this is by far and away the best object. When we can recognize our own suffering, we can then recognize the suffering that all other beings are in, all other normal sentient beings are in. And this is the basis of the compassion of the bodhisattva. So not just being ill, not just having coarse pain, but this recognition of the bound nature, of absolutely being bound completely in samsara through ignorance and the afflictions. This is absolutely the core basis of compassion, of Buddhist compassion. So in one sense, one can argue that there is a specific Buddhist compassion which is distinct from other types of compassion because it's linked to recognizing Buddhist suffering, and Buddhist suffering is linked to the idea of the 12 factors of dependent arising. So within that, when we begin to understand how suffering is caused, how we're bound to it, then we begin to really lose so much fascination, if you like, or enchantment towards samsara and samsaric life. So this is really, in a sense, why one can begin to say that as a sincere practitioner, if we really want to make a difference, then understanding how the mechanism of how we're bound to samsara or to ignorance, both within a life by life, but also from a moment to moment point of view, then we can really start saying, I understand how I'm bound, and therefore I must do something about it. He says this is really essentially why the 12 factors of dependent arising are so essential to any sincere Buddhist practitioner. And then he actually just says exactly what I said. So um, um, he says you need to understand well how cyclic existence, the aggregates and suffering is formed through the power of its origin, calming the afflictions, in particular how the wheel of existence turns in the context of 12 factors. Understanding this, becoming familiar with it, destroys the gloom of confusion, which is the root of all our problems. It eradicates mistaken views, holding external and internal compositional activities to arise causelessly. It increases the wealth of the treasury of the Buddha's teachings, and it is what motivates us towards the path to liberation through exact knowledge of the characteristics of samsara, and develops an intense disenchantment with them. So this is the best way for us to activate the latent propensities by which we will achieve the sublime state of enlightenment. And therefore, he says, the Tantra requested by Subahu, the Tantric text says, the path of dependent arising destroys ignorance. And again, back to the Rice Sealing Sutra, it says, when you understand dependent arising well, you put an end to all bad views, um, that take their object as the beginning, end, or the present. And Master Nagarjuna said, the dependent arising is the profound treasure in the storehouse of the conqueror's speech or the Buddha's speech. It says, of all the great treasures of Buddha Dharma, dependent arising is the true deep treasure. So then this says that essentially there were a pair of students who went round, and he said, I think this is a bit of a not necessarily true, but on the other hand, the painting that Buddha was sent. So what it says here is the teacher seeing this said, Buddha said, because there aren't always great teachers on dependent arising, um, make a painting in the gatehouse of each monastery that has a 5-part wheel of existence, around the circumference of which draw the 12 dependent arisings in both forward and reverse progressions. And this was how the wheel of existence, the Bhava Chakra supposedly was born. Although this isn't a base of discipline, I'm not really convinced that this arose from the original Buddha, although maybe I'm being a heretic by saying so. But it certainly is present in India, and it's found on every single um, monastery in Tibet. So that is a very, very quick, rather sketchy presentation of the 12 links of existence. While I can't promise to have imparted great deals of insight into its nature, I do think it is worthwhile, at least, in fact, I do recommend thinking for ourselves how things work in terms of how does the mind work, what is it that I grasp at, and why do I, what is it that makes me attached to things, and how does that affect me? So thinking about it without necessarily going through a text, a Dharma text, but actually thinking about it in terms of our own experience helps us really to actually then recognize what the 12 links are talking about. And it likewise, it also then provides us with, it informs us about how we actually experience it day to day. So there's one of the things about this is it definitely helps us to think how deeply enmeshed we are in samsaric behavior. We do it all the time, just naturally, spontaneously. We engage in these behaviors which are completely keep us bound to normal life. So we do have an opportunity here to think, well, if I can recognize, once I begin to recognize that causal chain, um, not in a sort of metaphysical way, but in a practical, pragmatic way that I can recognize in myself, then I can begin to lose some of that fascination. Yeah? So again, I think really, although the text is quite rich, this particular chapter is quite rich, I think the actual messages are very, very important for us to develop in terms of recognizing how our mind works a little bit, in terms of uh, the effect that we have of being able to begin to mitigate coarse attachment, coarse hostility, and so on. So we have um, three more chapters, so 3 more weeks today of this semester, I think. So, but what we're going to do is right now today, the next is or maybe it's two, but the next chapter is quite small. It's all about the meaning of the medium scope, and then what we'll do is we'll look at the path, the truth of the path, and then which is very brief, because we're going to spend most of the time um, in the remaining two books exploring the Mahayana, or the apex of the pyramid. So hopefully we'll start that next semester. Yeah. But meanwhile, let's dedicate any benefits there are to uh, hopefully that maybe there was something that Ben said which may be a little bit inspiring in terms of thinking about how I can best practice. If not, well, um, then Ben will do his best in future. But if not, then maybe I can find a way of learning something more myself, or ways of helping. Um, but anything, any benefit whatsoever, however small, may it be given to and directed towards my personal ability to benefit all beings from this moment onwards without any problem. So that's the only thing I think is worthwhile saying. Thank you very much. Let us just spend a minute or two meditating, um, either on the breath or thinking about how our minds, how afflictions arise in the mind.